My daughter-in-law whispered, "He can't stay here forever," to my son. I was in the next room. I'd been ready for 3 months. My daughter-in-law did not know I was in the next room. That is the only explanation I have ever been able to arrive at. Because Keisha is an intelligent woman, and she would not have said what she said if she had known I was standing 6 feet away in the hallway outside the kitchen door, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I listened to her tell my son exactly what she thought about my continued presence in the house where I had lived for 31 years. She said, "Jared, he can't stay here forever. You know that. We've talked about this." Jared said something I could not fully make out. She said, "I'm not saying anything against your father. I'm saying this is our house now and we have a right to make decisions about our own home." I stood in the hallway, the coffee in my hand. The particular quality of light that came through the window at the end of the hall on Tuesday mornings, which I had been watching for 31 years and which I had not expected to be standing in while I learned that my son's wife had decided I was a problem to be managed. I did not walk into the kitchen. I did not say anything. I turned around, went back to my room, sat in the chair by the window, and thought about the conversation I had started 3 months earlier with my attorney. 3 months. I had been ready for 3 months. This is the story of what happens when a daughter-in-law forgets that a man who spent 35 years running a newspaper knows exactly how to document what he hears. My name is Michael Okafor. I am 70 years old. I was born in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a Nigerian-American accountant who had come to this country in 1962 with a degree in mathematics and a belief, which he held until the day he died, that the most powerful thing a person could possess in America was a documented record of what was true. My father kept records of everything, every bill, every contract, every letter received and sent. He had rows of filing cabinets in the basement of our house on Bryden Road that contained, in chronological order, every significant document from his professional and personal life going back to his arrival in this country. I inherited this habit and the philosophy behind it. In 35 years of running a newspaper, I never made a decision of consequence without creating a written record of the reasoning behind it. I never had a significant conversation without following it with a letter or a memo that established what had been said and agreed. In the newspaper business, this is called documentation. In life, it is called evidence. The distinction between those two words is smaller than most people realize. I bought the Millbrook Courier in 1986 when I was 32 years old. It was a weekly community newspaper serving a mid-sized suburb of Columbus with a circulation of 11,000 and a staff of 7. I paid for it with a combination of savings, a small business loan, and an investment from my father, who reviewed the financials for 3 weeks before committing and who told me the paper was undervalued by approximately 40%, which turned out to be accurate. Over 35 years, I built the Courier into a genuine institution. We covered the school board and the city council and the local courts and the occasional story that mattered beyond our circulation area. We won State Press Association awards 11 times. We were the last independently owned newspaper in our county when I sold the paper 4 years ago to a regional media group, and I sold it not because I wanted to, but because the economics of print journalism had changed in ways that made independent ownership increasingly difficult to sustain with integrity. I sold for enough to retire comfortably. My wife Gloria and I moved into the house on Sycamore Drive, which we had owned since 1991 and which had been our family home for 3 decades. Gloria passed 2 years ago. Parkinson's disease, slow and relentless. She was 67 years old and we had been married for 42 years, and she had been the person who kept every version of my life running with a combination of warmth and precision that I have never stopped being grateful for. After Gloria passed, I stayed in the house on Sycamore Drive. I was not ready to leave, and there was no particular reason I should have been. It was a 4-bedroom house on a quiet street with a garden Gloria had spent 20 years developing and a study where I kept my books and my files, and where I still spent most of my mornings reading and writing the column. I continued to contribute monthly to the Courier under its new ownership. Then Jared and Keisha moved in. Jared is my only child. He is 41 years old, and he has, in equal measure, his mother's warmth and my stubbornness, which is a combination that serves him well in his work as a high school history teacher and less well in his marriage, which has always required more flexibility than stubbornness permits. He and Keisha had been living in an apartment in Westerville when Gloria passed. The apartment was fine but small, and they had been talking about buying a house and had not yet found the right one. And when Gloria died and I was suddenly alone in a 4-bedroom house, it seemed natural and practical and genuinely kind for them to move in. Jared suggested it. I agreed. Keisha, as far as I understood at the time, agreed as well. Keisha is 38 years old. She works in human resources for a large healthcare company, and she has in her professional life a specific and practiced quality of organizational efficiency that she applies with equal thoroughness to her personal life. She manages things. She manages schedules and budgets and relationships and the particular logistics of a shared household with the same focused competence she brings to her professional work. This is not a criticism. Organization is a genuine virtue. What it becomes when applied without sufficient warmth to the people being organized is something else. She had been warm to me before Gloria passed. She visited regularly. She brought food. She sat with Gloria during difficult periods when Jared was at school and I needed to leave the house briefly. I have never doubted that she was genuinely kind during those months, and I have never stopped being grateful for it. What changed after Gloria passed and after they moved into the house on Sycamore Drive was subtle enough that I could not have named it precisely in the first months. A shift in the quality of Keisha's attention, a change in the way she moved through the house, from visitor to resident to something that was almost but not quite owner. Small things. Where she positioned herself at the dinner table, how she described the house in conversations with friends who visited, the particular ease with which she began making decisions about shared spaces without consultation. I noticed these things the way I had noticed things in the newspaper business for 35 years, which is to say carefully and without rushing to conclusion. A story is not a story until you have more than one source. An impression is not a fact until it is confirmed. I was noting impressions. I was waiting for confirmation. It came on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 feet away through a kitchen door, in my daughter-in-law's voice. The first sign had come 2 months before the kitchen conversation, at a Sunday dinner in August. Keisha had cooked, which she did well and which I appreciated, and after dinner we had sat at the table with coffee and the particular comfort of a shared meal, and she had said, with the casual precision of someone raising a subject they have been waiting to raise, that she had been thinking about the house. I said, "What about it?" She said, "It's a lot of space for 3 people. Jared and I have been talking about eventually starting a family. When that happens, we're going to need the space organized differently." I said that seemed reasonable to plan for. She said, "There's also the question of the long term. I don't want to be indelicate, but at some point you might want to think about what makes sense for you, whether this is really the right situation permanently." I said I found the house comfortable and had no immediate plans to change my living situation. She said, "Of course, I'm just thinking ahead." Jared said nothing during this exchange. He looked at his coffee. After dinner, I went to my study and sat at my desk and thought about what Keisha had said and what she had not said and what the space between those two things meant. I had spent 35 years editing copy, and the most important skill in editing copy is understanding what a sentence is actually doing as opposed to what it appears to be doing. What Keisha's sentences were doing was establishing a position. She was not asking a question. She was marking territory. I called my attorney the following morning. His name was Richard Osei. He had handled the sale of the Courier and had updated my will and estate documents when Gloria passed. He was 58 and precise in the way of attorneys who have spent enough years in practice to understand that precision is the only protection against regret. I told him about the dinner conversation. He listened without comment until I finished. Then he said, "Michael, what does your current will say?" I told him. The house on Sycamore Drive and the majority of the estate were to go to Jared. A portion was designated for charitable contributions Gloria and I had discussed. There was a provision establishing a modest endowment for a journalism scholarship at Ohio State in Gloria's name, Richard said. And is there any existing arrangement that gives Jared or Keisha any authority over the estate or the property during your lifetime? I said there was not. He said, "Good. What is it you want me to do?" I said, "Nothing yet. I want to understand the full shape of this before I decide anything. But I want you aware and I want you available." He said, "I'll be here." The conversation I heard through the kitchen door on a Tuesday morning in October was not the first conversation Keisha and Jared had been having about my situation. I understood that the moment I heard it, the fluency of it, the particular shorthand of two people returning to a subject they had visited many times. She said, "He can't stay here forever. You know that. We've talked about this." Jared said something about not wanting to rush anything. She said, "I'm not saying rush. I'm saying plan. There's a difference. The longer we wait, the harder it gets." Jared said my name. I could hear the discomfort in it. She said, "I know he's your father. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking you to be realistic. This is our house, Jared. We're the ones paying the mortgage. We have a right to think about our future in it." I stood in the hallway with the cold coffee. I did not move. In 35 years of journalism, I had learned that the most valuable information is the information people share when they believe they are not being observed. You do not interrupt that. You listen until it is finished, and then you take what you have heard and you decide what to do with it. She said, "The will hasn't been updated since Gloria died. If something happens to him before we get this sorted out." Jared said, "Keisha," she said, "I'm just being practical. He's 70 years old. We need to know where we stand." I turned around and walked back to my room. I sat in the chair by Gloria's window, the one she had used to read in the mornings when the light came through at the angle she liked. I looked at the garden she had planted below. The dahlias she had put in the year before she got sick, still coming back every year. The way things that have been properly rooted tend to come back. I called Richard that afternoon. I said, "It's time, let's begin." What Richard and I built over the following 8 weeks I will describe in its essential structure because the details matter to understanding what happened and why. The first thing we did was a comprehensive review of the existing will. Richard had prepared it after Gloria's death, and it was sound in its basic architecture. The house to Jared, the charitable provisions, the journalism scholarship. What it did not contain was any mechanism to account for a circumstance in which Jared's decision-making might be influenced by a third party with interests that diverged from my own. We addressed this. The revised will contain 3 changes of substance. The first was a charitable remainder trust established for the house on Sycamore Drive. The trust provided that I would retain full use and occupancy of the house for the remainder of my natural life, with complete authority over all decisions related to its management and maintenance. Upon my death, the house would be sold and the proceeds divided equally between the Journalism Scholarship Endowment and a community foundation Gloria had supported for 15 years. Jared was named as a beneficiary of the scholarship endowment, but not as a direct inheritor of the property. The second change was the establishment of a letter of instruction, a document that accompanied the will and that described, in my own words, the reasoning behind each significant provision. The letter of instruction is not a legal document in the formal sense, but it creates a narrative record that courts and trustees find useful when disputes arise. My letter of instruction described, with the specificity that 35 years of journalism had made second nature to me, the conversations I had observed and the concerns they had raised and the reasoning that had led me to the decisions the will reflected. The third change was the appointment of Richard himself as the executor of the estate, replacing Jared, who had been named executor in the previous version. This was the change I had thought longest about. Jared was not complicit in what Keisha was planning. I was certain of that. But an executor has significant authority over the administration of an estate, and I had decided that I wanted that authority in hands that were entirely independent of the household dynamics on Sycamore Drive. Richard reviewed the final documents 4 times. I read every page twice. I signed on a Thursday morning in his office with his notary present. On the way home, I stopped at the garden center and bought 3 dahlia bulbs for the bed along the south fence where Gloria had wanted to extend the planting and where she had not had time to do it before she got sick. I planted them that afternoon. The conversation I had been waiting for came on a Saturday evening in December. Jared had made dinner. He cooked well on the occasions he chose to cook, which were infrequent enough that the occasions felt like events. We ate at the table in the dining room and talked about his students, and about a history documentary he had been watching, and about a cousin of mine in Columbus who had just retired. After dinner, Keisha said she had something she wanted to raise, and she hoped we could discuss it openly and without anyone feeling defensive. I said, of course. She said she and Jared had been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about the house, and about what made sense for everyone. She said they had found a retirement community in Dublin that had a very good reputation, and that they had taken a tour and thought I might be interested in seeing it. She slid a brochure across the table. It was glossy and well-produced. Photographs of older residents in sunlit common rooms, walking paths, a putting green. She said, "It's a beautiful facility, and it would give you community, people your own age, activities. It would take the burden of the house off everyone." I looked at the brochure. I looked at my son, who was not looking at me. He was looking at the table with the expression I had seen on his face twice before in his adult life. Once when he had to tell me he had failed his driver's test the second time, and once when he had to tell me he and Keisha were separating briefly in the second year of their marriage before they reconciled. The expression of a man delivering news he did not choose to deliver. I said, "Keisha, how long have you been planning this conversation?" She said, "This isn't planned. We've just been thinking." I said, "You've been thinking about this since August. You raised the subject at dinner in August, and I told you I was comfortable in the house. Then in October you told Jared I couldn't stay here forever and that you needed to know where you stood regarding the will." A silence. She said, "You heard that." I said, "I was in the hallway, yes." Jared said, "Dad." I said, "Jared, let me finish." He was quiet. I said, "I want to be precise about this because precision matters to me. Keisha, I do not believe you are a bad person. I believe you are a practical person who looked at a situation and decided to manage it the way you manage things at work, by identifying the problem and developing a solution and implementing the solution efficiently. I understand that approach. I used it myself for 35 years. She was looking at me with the careful expression of someone who is trying to determine how much information the other person has. I reached into the folder I had placed on the sideboard before dinner. I put 3 documents on the table. The first was the cover page of the revised will, showing the date of execution and Richard's signature as supervising attorney. I did not give them the full document. I gave them the cover page and the summary page that described the principal provisions. The second was the deed to the house on Sycamore Drive, currently registered in my name alone, with a notation showing the charitable remainder trust that had been established the previous month. The third was a 1-page letter I had written myself, in the particular style of 35 years of newspaper writing, that described what I had heard through the kitchen door in October and what I had understood it to mean and what I had done in response. I said, "The house is in a charitable remainder trust. I have full occupancy and authority for the remainder of my life. When I die, the proceeds go to the Journalism Scholarship and the Community Foundation, not to the estate. This has been executed and registered and cannot be changed without my specific authorization." Keisha looked at the deed. She looked at the trust documentation. She said, "When did you do this?" I said, "I began the process the morning after dinner in August. I completed it in November." She said, "You never said anything." I said, "You never asked me directly. You managed around the subject. I documented what I heard and I took appropriate steps." I looked at her steadily. "That is what a person does when they have spent 35 years in a business where the written record is the only thing that protects anyone." Jared said, "Dad, I didn't know about the will." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I wouldn't have." I said, "I know that too." He looked at Keisha. She was still looking at the documents on the table. I said, "I am not leaving this house. I will leave when I choose to leave and not before. What I am asking of both of you is this. If you have concerns about the future, about your plans for this house, about what you need from your lives that you are not currently getting, I would like you to tell me those things directly. Not in the kitchen when you think I am in the other end of the house. Not through brochures for retirement communities. Directly, as adults." A long silence. Keisha said, "I just wanted to know we had a plan." I said, "Now you know the plan. The plan is that I live in my house on my terms for as long as I choose. That is the plan." She nodded slowly. It was not the nod of someone who was fully reconciled to what she was hearing. It was the nod of someone who had encountered a situation that had not resolved the way she had expected and was deciding how to proceed. Jared said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." He said, "I should have talked to you directly." I said, "Yes, you should have, but you didn't, and I understand why you didn't, and we are going to have to do better going forward. All three of us." I picked up the brochure from the table. I looked at the putting green photograph. I set it down. I said, "I don't play golf." Keisha and Jared stayed in the house on Sycamore Drive for another 8 months after that Saturday dinner. In April of the following year, they bought a house of their own in a neighborhood 12 minutes away, which was a decision I was glad about and which I understood had been coming regardless of how the December conversation had gone. The decision to buy their own place was, I believe, the right one. They needed their own space and their own decisions and their own version of a home that was not in any way mine. That is how it should be. A home is not something you inherit from someone else's life. It is something you build from your own. Jared called me on the day they got the keys to their house. He was happy in the particular way of a man who has arrived somewhere he had been trying to get to for a long time. I told him I was glad. I meant it. Keisha called me 2 days later. She said she wanted to apologize for the kitchen conversation and for the approach she had taken and for not being more direct about what she actually needed. She said it in the way that people say things they have been practicing saying, which is not the same as saying them naturally, but it was honest enough and I accepted it as such. I said, "Keisha, I want you to understand something. The journalism scholarship and the community foundation were already in Gloria's in my plans before any of this happened. What I changed was the mechanism, not the intention. I moved the house into the trust to protect it during my lifetime. What happens after is what Gloria and I planned. That was always true." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know that." I said, "No, you didn't." Richard handled the transfer of the trust documentation smoothly and without drama, which is his particular skill. The house on Sycamore Drive remains in the Charitable Remainder Trust. I remain in the house. The dahlias Gloria planted came back a third time this spring, which I count as confirmation that things rooted properly tend to persist. I still write my monthly column for the Courier. The current editor, a young woman named Patricia Chen, who has been in the job for 2 years and who is very good at it, gives me more space than I probably deserve and edits me with a light hand that I appreciate. Last month I wrote about what it means to document the truth, which is a subject I have been thinking about for 60 years and which has not stopped being interesting. I am 70 years old. I spent 35 years in a business where the most important thing was not what happened, but what was recorded. Where the story that persisted was the story that was written down, that was sourced and verified and documented in ways that could be examined by anyone who needed to examine them. That lesson applies outside the newspaper business. It applies at kitchen doors and dinner tables and in conversations with attorneys and in the careful construction of documents that say clearly and precisely what you intend them to say. Keisha was not wrong that I am 70 years old and that the future requires planning. She was wrong about who gets to do that planning and on whose behalf. The answer to both of those questions is me, for as long as I am capable of answering them, which I intend to be for a considerable time yet. What I want to say to you If you are a person who has found yourself being managed by people who have decided that your age or your grief or your circumstances have made you a problem to be solved rather than a person to be consulted, is this: you are not a problem. You are a person. The planning that concerns your life is yours to do. Document what you observe. Write it down. Date it. Keep the record. And find a good attorney who answers on the second ring. The house on Sycamore Drive is mine. Gloria's garden is coming back. The dahlias are the best they have been in 3 years. I am not going anywhere. Tell me in the comments. Has someone ever tried to manage your future without asking you about it? I want to hear from you.